In one alternate reality, the year 1914 was celebrated for the first transatlantic passenger airship voyage, not the start of a Great War. Scientists in another timeline jointly renounced atomic weapons in 1939, leading to a century of unprecedented global research collaboration. Imagine Aztec and Ming dynasty scholars co-authoring treatises on astronomy in the 1600s, their empires linked by peaceful sea lanes. These aren't dreams, but glimpses into worlds that sidestep some of history's greatest tragedies, all because of a few different choices. Number 10. The Alexandrian Renaissance that never ended. Imagine a world where Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror, didn't succumb to fever in Babylon in 323 BCE. Instead, after a brief illness, he recovered. His ambition undimmed, but his approach subtly changed. He lived for another 30 years, long enough to truly consolidate his vast empire that stretched from Greece to India. The immediate consequence was the absence of the bloody wars of the Diadochi, the decades-long conflict among his generals for pieces of his domain. His son, Alexander IV, was properly mentored and came to rule a unified staple realm. How did this lead to lasting peace? Alexander, in his later years, focused less on conquest and more on administration and cultural fusion. He established a common language, Koine, Greek, not by force, but through incentives for trade and scholarship. He poured resources into the city he founded, Alexandria in Egypt. The Library of Alexandria became a true wonder, attracting scholars from all corners of the empire and beyond. It wasn't just a repository of scrolls. It was a vibrant research institution. They developed early forms of steam engines for irrigation and simple machinery by 100 CE. Cartography and astronomy flourished, leading to accurate world maps centuries earlier than in our timeline. The empire didn't remain a monolith forever. Over centuries, it evolved much like the British Commonwealth in some regards. Regions gained autonomy, but remained linked by trade, a shared intellectual tradition, and a system of mutual defense primarily used for policing trade routes and deterring external threats, which were fewer as the empire's stability projected peace. Without the Roman Empire's specific rise and fall as we know it, and without the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, scientific and social progress continued, albeit at its own pace. By 1000 CE, this Alexandrian Commonwealth was a network of interconnected states where philosophy, arts, and sciences thrived. And large-scale warfare was a distant memory, something studied in ancient history texts, derailing Alexander's early campaigns. Disputes between states were settled by a grand council of philosophers and scholars, whose rulings were respected due to their intellectual authority and the demonstrated benefits of peace. Number 9. The Great American Powwow of 1600. In this timeline, the arrival of Europeans in the Americas unfolded very differently. The key divergence happened around 1550. Devastating European diseases still swept through parts of the Americas, but in certain key regions, particularly along the eastern seaboard and in the Mississippi Valley, a combination of factors lessened their impact. Perhaps some earlier limited contact with Vikings or Basque fishermen had introduced milder versions of diseases, leading to some acquired immunity. More importantly, visionary leaders among several major indigenous nations like the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, the Powhatan Confederacy, and the Mississippian cultures saw the fragmented European arrivals not just as a threat, but as a catalyst for unprecedented unity. Inspired by existing confederacies but on a much grander scale, these leaders convened what became known as the Great American Powwow of 1600. It was a decades-long process, not a single event, resulting in the formation of the Federated Nations of Turtle Island. This federation wasn't a centralized empire, but a defensive and economic alliance with a Grand Council where representatives from dozens of nations deliberated. They standardized trade practices, established common defense protocols, and crucially adopted and adapted some European technologies that trickled in, particularly metallurgy, for tools and firearms for hunting and defense. They didn't seek to mimic European society, but to selectively integrate tools that strengthened their own. When larger waves of European colonists began arriving in the early 17th century, they didn't find scattered warring tribes, but a powerful, organized entity capable of negotiating from a position of strength. There were conflicts, to be sure, localized and quickly contained, but no widespread conquest. Instead, treaties were signed, establishing European trading posts and limited settlements, often as leaseholds rather than outright colonies. The Federated Nations, rich in resources and manpower, became a major player on the world stage. Instead of centuries of war and dispossession, the Americas saw a unique cultural synthesis. European immigrants still came, but they assimilated into a Mayano society where indigenous languages, philosophies, and governance systems remained dominant, enriched by European science and arts. By the 19th century, the Federated Nations were a global power characterized by environmental stewardship rooted in indigenous traditions, and a remarkably decentralized, consensus-based political system that avoided large internal wars. Number 8. When Rome gently faded to gold. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall in 476 CE in this version of history. The divergence point was earlier, around the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century CE. Instead of his son Commodus, a series of capable, philosophically minded emperors followed, inspired by Aurelius's stoicism and sense of duty. They recognized the empire's overextension and internal pressures. Instead of fighting endless wars on the frontiers and suppressing internal dissent, they embarked on a radical centuries-long project of managed devolution and transformation. They gradually granted more autonomy to provinces, turning them into federated states with significant local governance, while Rome remained a cultural and symbolic center, more like a guiding hand than an iron fist. The military was reformed into a more defensive force, and resources were shifted towards infrastructure, education, and integrating Germanic and other barbarian peoples peacefully. Instead of being invaders, many tribes became citizens and allies. Their leaders incorporated into regional senates and councils. Roman law and administration were adapted, not abandoned, providing a common framework. Crucially, institutions of learning, like schools and libraries, were maintained and even expanded. There was no widespread loss of classical knowledge, no dark ages descending upon Europe. Instead, urban centers continued to thrive, and technological innovation, though perhaps slow, was steady. Aqueducts were maintained, roads kept in repair. Latin evolved, but its core persisted, ensuring continued communication and access to older texts. By the 8th century CE, what was once the Western Roman Empire was a commonwealth of Roman successor states, Gallia, Hispania, Italia, Britannia, and others, including new states formed by integrated Germanic peoples. These states traded, collaborated on large projects, and largely avoided major wars between themselves, having learned the benefits of cooperation. This Roman Commonwealth, with its preserved knowledge and stable societies, entered what we would call the medieval period with a far more advanced starting point, leading to an earlier Renaissance and a more peaceful development of Europe, free from centuries of fragmented feudal warfare. Number 7. Plessis' gift, the Pacific Harmony. The great Chinese treasure fleets, commanded by Admiral Plessis in the early 15th century, were a marvel of their time. In our history, they were abruptly halted, and China turned inwards. In this alternate timeline, the Xuan Emperor, who took the throne in 1425, was an even more enthusiastic patron of these voyages than his predecessor. Perhaps a key advisor convinced him of the immense long-term benefits of global trade and exploration. So, the voyages continued and expanded. Zheng's fleets not only rounded Africa and established contact with European kingdoms decades before Vasco da Gama, but they also sailed east, systematically exploring the Pacific. They made sustained, peaceful contact with the civilizations of the Americas, the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mississippians in the mid-1400s. This was not a conquest. The Ming dynasty of this era was not interested in territorial expansion overseas. They were interested in trade, knowledge, and projecting the glory of the Middle Kingdom. They brought gifts, established small, mutually agreed-upon trading posts, and initiated a profound exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The impact was good. Chinese innovations, advanced shipbuilding, agricultural techniques, perhaps even early forms of printing, spread to the Americas. American crops like potatoes, corn, and chili peppers flowed back to China, and then, via Chinese traders, to the rest of the world, revolutionizing agriculture globally and preventing many famines. European nations, upon making their own transatlantic voyages later, found not a new world ripe for conquest, but established continents with powerful organized states already engaged in a sophisticated trans-Pacific trade network with China. Colonialism, as we know it, became impossible. Instead, a multipolar world developed. The Americas developed powerful, indigenous-led states that incorporated and adapted new technologies. Europe still had its Renaissance and age of exploration, but it was one of discovery and trade, not domination. By the 18th century, the world was a vibrant network of interacting civilizations. Chinese, Indian, European, American, African, each retaining its unique character but connected by peaceful commerce and a shared understanding. Major global conflicts were rare because power was more evenly distributed, and the economic benefits of peace were clear to all major players. Number 6. The Philosopher King's Gambit. Imagine, it's the mid-18th century, the height of the Enlightenment. In a major European kingdom, let's say a fictionalized version of Prussia or Austria, a young, brilliant monarch ascends the throne. This ruler, whom history would call Sophia the Wise or Frederick the Reformer, was deeply influenced by thinkers like Locke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. But unlike many rulers who paid lip service to Enlightenment ideals, this monarch decided to implement them radically and peacefully. The divergence point was a personal conviction, perhaps a near-death experience, or a profound intellectual awakening led this ruler to believe that the true strength of a nation lay not in conquest or absolute power, but in the well-being and liberty of its people. Instead of building up massive armies for foreign wars, this monarch initiated a series of sweeping internal reforms. Serfdom was abolished. A comprehensive system of public education was established for all children, regardless of class or gender. Freedom of speech and the press were guaranteed. A new constitution was drafted, with a representative assembly, separation of powers, and an independent judiciary, effectively turning an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one by the monarch's own decree. This philosopher king's gambit was met with skepticism and some resistance from entrenched nobles, but the monarch, through charisma, popular support, as people saw tangible benefits, and shrewd political maneuvering, succeeded. The nation flourished. Economic productivity soared as former serfs became Inifi farmers and artisans. Scientific and artistic creativity blossomed in the open intellectual environment. Crucially, this nation became a beacon of stability and prosperity. Other European nations, seeing its success and facing increasing pressure from their own enlightened citizens, began to emulate these reforms. There were still tensions and political struggles, but the widespread bloody revolutions that characterized our late 18th and 19th centuries were largely averted. Instead of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe experienced an age of reform, where nations gradually adopted more liberal and representative governments through negotiation and internal pressure, inspired by the peaceful example of the first enlightened kingdom. This led to a 19th century focused on internal development, scientific advancement, and cautious international cooperation, rather than escalating nationalism and imperial rivalries. Number 5. The Vienna Symphony of Nations. Congress of Vienna in 1815, which redrew Europe's map after the Napoleonic Wars, aimed to create a lasting peace. In our timeline, it succeeded for a while, but ultimately couldn't prevent the rise of nationalism and the conflicts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In this alternate world, a few key figures at the Congress, perhaps a more forward-thinking Metternich, a more idealistic Tsar Alexander I, or a particularly persuasive Talleyrand, managed to forge a truly revolutionary system. The divergence was their decision to not just restore old orders, but to create a concert of Europe that was far more proactive and adaptive. They established a permanent international council, the Vienna Assembly, with representatives from all major European powers, and even some smaller ones. This assembly had real, though limited, powers to mediate disputes, to oversee disarmament treaties, and, most importantly, to address the burgeoning force of nationalism, not by suppressing it, but by guiding it. They championed the idea of cultural nations within larger federated empires or peaceful secessions where necessary and viable, rather than outright independence leading to constant border wars. Furthermore, this Vienna Assembly actively promoted economic cooperation. They facilitated free trade agreements, standardized weights and measures, and funded joint infrastructure, projects like continent-wide railway networks and canals. The Industrial Revolution still happened, but its benefits were shared more equitably, and competition was channeled into economic and scientific advancement rather than arms races. When crises arose, as they inevitably did, the Assembly provided a forum for genuine negotiation and compromise. There was no Crimean War as we knew it. Instead, a mediated solution was found for the Eastern question. The unification of Germany and Italy occurred, but through carefully managed processes overseen by the Assembly, avoiding the wars that marked their formation in our timeline. As a result, the 20th century dawned not with a build-up to a great war, but with Europe as a largely peaceful, interconnected federation of states, focused on continued progress and managing colonial territories, which still existed, but under stricter international oversight, aimed at eventual self-governance with a lighter, more development-focused hand. The Vienna Symphony played on a harmonious arrangement of nations. Number 4. The Reformation's Quiet Dawn. Protestant Reformation in the 16th century tore Europe apart, leading to devastating religious wars like the 30 Years' War. Imagine if in the early days of the Reformation, around 1520 to 1530, a different path was taken. Perhaps Martin Luther was slightly more diplomatic, or perhaps key figures within the Catholic Church, like Erasmus of Rotterdam, gained more influence and pushed for internal reform and reconciliation with the emerging Protestant movements. The divergence could be a series of crucial theological conferences, where, instead of hardening positions, genuine efforts were made to find common ground on core Christian doctrines, focusing on shared values rather than divisive interpretation. Alternatively, a powerful secular ruler, perhaps Emperor Charles V, motivated by a desire to avoid the fracturing of his empire, could have used his influence to enforce a policy of religious tolerance and dialogue much earlier and more effectively than the Peace of Augsburg. This wouldn't mean an immediate end to all theological disputes, but it would prevent them from escalating into large-scale state-sponsored warfare. Imagine a Europe where a Diet of Reconciliation hammered out a framework for religious coexistence. Churches might still split, but communities would have legal protections to practice their chosen faith. Consequences would be profound. Without decades, even centuries, of devastating religious wars, European societies would be far more stable. Resources spent on armies and fortifications would instead be invested in education, arts, and infrastructure. The scientific revolution already underway would accelerate unhindered by religious persecution from either side. Intellectual life would flourish in an environment of greater tolerance for diverse viewpoints. The energy that fueled religious fanaticism would be channeled into other pursuits: exploration, innovation, and social improvement. While religious diversity would be a fact of life, it would become a source of intellectual richness rather than conflict. By the 17th century, Europe would be a patchwork of faiths, but one where different denominations largely coexisted peacefully, their interactions fostering a more robust and nuanced understanding of spirituality and philosophy. Number 3. The Iron Chancellor's Dove. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, unified Germany through brilliant diplomacy and carefully calculated wars. In our timeline, after achieving unification in 1871, he focused on preserving Germany's dominance through a complex system of alliances that, while maintaining peace for a time, also contributed to the tensions leading to World War I. In this alternate scenario, Bismarck undergoes a shift in his later career. Perhaps a personal tragedy or a deep reflection on the costs of war leads him to a different vision for Germany and Europe. The divergence occurs around 1875. Having secured German unification, this Bismarck decides that Germany's future and Europe's lies not in a precarious balance of power maintained by military threat, but in active peace-building. He uses Germany's newfound industrial and political strength not to intimidate, but to mediate and foster cooperation. He spearheads the creation of a European Economic Community, a precursor to the EU, focusing on lowering trade barriers, standardizing industrial practices, and funding joint scientific research. He actively works to resolve colonial disputes between European powers through a dedicated international tribunal, preventing scrambles for territory from escalating into direct conflicts between major powers. Germany, under Bismarck's continued guidance, perhaps he lives a few years longer, or his chosen successors faithfully continue his policy, becomes known as the honest broker of Europe in a truly positive sense. Instead of an arms race, there's a peace race, as nations compete in industrial output for civilian markets and scientific breakthroughs. French resentment over Alsace-Lorraine is slowly soothed through special autonomous status and economic integration. Britain and Germany, instead of naval rivals, become partners in global development projects. The complex web of alliances Bismarck weaves is explicitly defensive and aimed at de-escalation. As a result, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand visits Sarajevo in 1914, if such a figure even exists in the same context, the existing international mechanisms for crisis resolution are robust and trusted. The incident, or any similar spark, is handled through diplomacy and arbitration, not ultimatums and mobilization. 20th century begins with Europe as a cooperative powerhouse, its energies devoted to progress rather than self-destruction. Number 2. The Atomic Peace of 1939. In the late 1930s, physicists around the world were on the cusp of understanding nuclear fission. In our timeline, This knowledge led to the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombs that ended World War II, ushering in the nuclear age and the Cold War. In this alternate reality, a small group of leading scientists, figures like Einstein, Bohr, Fermi, Szilard, perhaps from different countries but communicating through their international scientific networks, have a collective moment of profound ethical crisis, slightly early in 1938 or early 1939. The divergence point is a secret emergency conference they convene. Horrified by the implications of their discoveries, particularly the potential for an unstoppable chain reaction and a weapon of unimaginable destructive power, they make a pact. They decide unanimously that this knowledge is too dangerous for any single nation to possess or weaponize. They agree to jointly publish their core findings, not in scientific journals, but in a public appeal to all major world governments, simultaneously revealing the terrifying potential of atomic energy and proposing an immediate, verifiable international ban on any research leading to atomic weapons. They also highlight the immense potential for peaceful atomic energy if developed under strict international control. This public unified plea from the world's most respected scientists creates an unprecedented global shockwave. Faced with a clear scientifically backed existential threat, and with the details of the potential weapon now public knowledge, making a secret arms race much harder, national leaders are forced to the negotiating table. An international atomic control agency is established with sweeping powers to inspect and monitor all nuclear research worldwide. Funds that might have gone into weapons development are instead pooled into peaceful applications, nuclear medicine, energy generation, and fundamental research. The looming threat of World War II, while not entirely dissipated as tensions were already high, is significantly altered. Prospect of any nation secretly developing an atomic bomb and using it becomes a shared global fear, acting as a powerful deterrent against total war. This atomic peace, born of scientific responsibility, steers the world away from nuclear annihilation and fosters a new era of international scientific collaboration, tackling global challenges like disease and energy, with resources that would otherwise have fueled a catastrophic arms race and the Cold War. Number 1. The Digital Library of Babel. Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace dreamt of mechanical computers, the difference engine, and the analytical engine in the mid-19th century. In our world, their work was largely theoretical due to lack of funding and technological limitations. In this alternate timeline, a crucial divergence occurs. A far-sighted patron, perhaps a wealthy industrialist, or an enlightened government body recognize the immense potential of their work and provides sustained, massive funding starting around 1840. This leads to the successful construction and continuous improvement of analytical engines. These mechanical and later electromechanical computing devices become indispensable tools for science, engineering, and government. By the late 19th century, computation houses exist in major cities, processing vast amounts of data. Lovelace's vision of these machines composing music or creating graphics begins to be realized. The real revolution, however, comes with the development of information networking. Inspired by the telegraph engineers devise ways to link these analytical engines first within cities, then across nations by the early 1900s. This creates a nascent logos net, a global information sharing network. The impact on the 20th century is staggering. Access to information and the ability to communicate complex ideas globally almost instantly transforms diplomacy, science, and culture. International research projects flourish as scientists can collaborate in real time. Misunderstandings between nations are harder to sustain when information flows more freely. The Digital Library of Babel isn't a single place, but the entirety of this interconnected knowledge. Political movements for transparency and global citizenship gain immense traction, as citizens can access diverse perspectives and scrutinize government actions more easily. Major international crises are debated openly on the Logos Nut, with public input from around the world influencing policy. Large-scale wars, like the world wars of our timeline, become almost unthinkable because their logistical and ideological underpinnings are eroded by this pervasive network of information and communication. Propaganda is much harder to sustain. Empathy and understanding across cultures grow as people can directly interact and share their stories. 20th century, instead of being an age of ideological conflict, becomes the century of connection, characterized by rapid collaborative progress in all fields and a global society grappling with the complexities of a truly interconnected world.